Hello students, it's time to level up your English. Today we're gonna learn about relative clauses. Relative clause is a part of a sentence. It tells us which person or thing or what kind of a person or thing the speaker means. So let's say an example. For example, the boy who fell off the tree is my nephew. So who fell off the tree tells us that which boy fall off the tree, which is my nephew. Types of relative clauses. There are two types of relative clauses: defining, or we call that restrictive, and another one is non-defining or non-restrictive clauses. So first we will see defining or restrictive relative clause. So this clause is essential to the meaning of the sentence by identifying a specific person or a thing. So defining clause limits or qualities the word it modifies, and it can't be omitted without changing the meaning of the sentence. So restrictive clauses should be introduced with the relative pronouns that who, which, whom, because they indicate the specific person or thing, and they should never be set off with commas. For example, I have a friend who plays the guitar, or I have a friend that plays a guitar. So decorating is a job that I hate. Decorating is a job which I hate. So it adds a specific thing or a person. Relative pronouns that refer to people and objects. So relative pronouns for people, we usually use who, whom, and whose, right? These are for people. So for example, in the case of who, we use who for subjects. For example, the teacher who taught me is retiring. So who is used in here instead of the teacher, or in the place of the teacher. So we use it as a subject. And the second is whom. So whom usually is used for objects when it's more formal. For example, the student whom I helped passed the exam. And whose indicates possession or belonging to something. So the author whose book won the award is speaking today. So in this case, whose indicates that the book belongs to this author. So whose indicates possession. So these relative pronouns are for people. And another we will see relative pronouns that we use for objects. So we use which and that. So which used for animals and things. So for example, the book which I borrowed was fascinating. So we can use which for things like this. And the next is that. So that can refer to people sometimes. It also can refer to animals and things, often used in defining clauses. For example, the car that you see over there is mine. Let's see examples in a sentence, and in the case of people and objects. So in the case of people, the first example, she is the artist who painted the mural. The man whom I met yesterday is a novelist. And in the case of objects, this is the laptop which I bought last year. The song that you heard on the radio is my favorite. So you can see how we used who and these different relative pronouns for people and objects. The second one is non-defining or non-restrictive relative clauses. So non-defining relative clauses, they provide additional information about a noun, but they do not limit it or they do not define it. So the sentence still makes sense without the clause. It's not mandatory. It still makes a sentence if you just cut off the non-defining clause, but it adds the information, and the information is often supplementary. So these kinds of clauses are usually set off by commas. Okay, we have said that for defining clauses, they are not set off by commas, but in this case, these clauses or non-defining clauses are set off by commas, and we have said that the sentence still makes sense without the clauses, which means it's not mandatory to have a sentence and non-defining clause. So there are relative pronouns that we use in non-defining relative clauses. For example, they are the same as in defining clauses, but the way we use it might be different. For example, in the case of who, my sister who lives in London is visiting us next week. Okay, so in this case, the sentence can also be my sister is visiting us next week, but you know we can also say my sister who lives in London is visiting us next week, which shows that the sentence can also stand alone without the non-defining clause. And in the case of who, it refers to people more formal. For example, Mr. Smith, whom you meet at the conference, is a renowned author. So it indicates possession. The function is the same. It's just the way we use it. And in the case of whose, let's say an example. Sarah, whose car is parked outside, just arrived. So in this case, which refers to animals or things. And in the case of which, we can use which for animals and things. So for example, the Eiffel Tower, which is in Paris, attracts millions of visitors each year. So generally, this is how we use these relative clauses in non-defining clauses. But that, in the case of that, it's not used in non-defining clauses, because instead of that, which is really preferred in non-defining clauses. So let's see more examples. For example, in the case of people, my neighbor who is an architect designed our house. So in this case, we can say my neighbor designed our house, but we choose to add an undefining clause, which is who is an architect, right? And in the case of possession, the book whose author is famous won an award. And in the case of things, the smartphone which I bought last year has an excellent camera. So you can see that you can just take out the non-defining clause, and the sentence could still make a meaning. That's what makes non-defining clause different from a defining clause. Relative clauses of time, place, and reason. So a relative clause can specify time, place, and also reason by providing additional context to the main clauses. That's the function of a relative clause. So when we see time, for example, I will never forget the day when we first met. And place, this is the park where we used to play as kids, and the reason she didn't attend the meeting because she was ill. So you can see how we use the relative clauses for time, place, and reason. So relative pronouns with prepositions. So when a preposition is used with a relative pronoun, the preposition can either precede the relative pronoun or be placed at the end of the clause. So this often occurs in a more formal context. For example, in the case of who, example with the preposition at the end, the teacher who I spoke to was very helpful. And another example with the preposition at the start, the teacher to whom I spoke was very helpful. You can see the difference here. And in the case of which, for example, with the preposition at the end, the book which I referred to is on the shelf. And at the start, when the preposition comes at the start, it is like the book to which I referred is on the shelf. And in the case of whom, when the preposition comes at the end, we can say the person whom you meet is my friend. And when the preposition comes at the start, we can say the person to whom you spoke is my friend. So the difference between defining and non-defining relative clauses. We have seen this in their own. We have seen non-defining relative clause and defining relative clause. Now we will see their differences. So defining relative clause, its purpose is to provide essential information that defines or restricts the noun. So in the case of punctuation, no commas are used in the case of defining a relative clause. For example, the book that you lent me is fascinating. This specifies which book, the book that you lent me, right? So there is no comma used in this sentence. So as you can see, this is one example of a defining a relative clause. So, and the second one, non-defining relative clause, its purpose is to provide an extra information. Okay, it's extra, and that can be omitted or leave out without changing the main meaning of a sentence. So it's just adding something, adding an extra meaning. So in the case of non-defining relative clause, commas are used to set off the clause. For example, the book, comma, which you lent me, comma, is fascinating. So this adds more information, but it's not essential to identify the book. For example, we can say the book is fascinating, which is perfectly a meaningful sentence, but we can also add which you lent me to make it a non-defining relative clause. Okay. Now let's do some questions. What punctuation do we use in non-defining a relative clause? Semicolon, comma, or period? The answer is commas, right? Yeah. The second question, which sentence has a defining relative clause? My sister, comma, who lives in London, is visiting. The book that I borrowed is on the table. The car, which is red, is parked outside. So the answer is the book that I borrowed is on the table. You can identify these kinds of questions by either seeing whether there is a comma or not, or by seeing if the clause can be omitted. Okay. In the third question, what type of relative clause gives an extra information and can be left out? Defining, non-defining, or both? Non-defining clauses are clauses that the information can be omitted or they can be taken out, and then there is we should use comma in the case of non-defining clauses, we have said. Yeah. And the next is you will fill in the blanks. A defining relative clause gives us essential information about blank. We write this using a defining relative clause. So the sentence is the book is on the table. It is blank. Find the defining relative clause in the sentence. The teacher blank teaches math is very strict. And the fourth question is non-defining relative clause are usually separated by blank. And the fifth question, rewrite this with a non-defining relative clause. My brother is coming to dinner. He blank in New York. Now let's do it together. So, defining relative clauses gives us essential information about a noun. So rewrite this using a relative clause. It says, so the book is on the table, it is mine. Example, answer, the book that is on the table is mine. And the third question, find the defining relative clause in the sentence. So the teacher who teaches math is very strict. So the non-defining relative clause are usually separated by commas. So the fifth one is rewrite this with a non-defining relative clause. My brother is coming to dinner. He lives in New York. So the example answer would be my brother who lives in New York is coming to dinner will be the answer. I think you have got all the answers right. If not, take a correction. So to summarize today's lesson, we have seen what a relative clause is. So relative clause adds information about nouns, and the defining clause is essential information, and there is no comma in the case of a defining clause. And non-defining relative clause, it adds an extra information, and we use commas in this case. And relative clauses can be clauses of time, place, and reason. And we have seen that pronouns with prepositions, they can be placed before or after the pronoun. Thank you for your time. ሁላችሁ የነበርኩት ሜሮን ግሩም ነበርኩ። በሌላ ሌሰን እስከምንገናኝ መልካም የትምህርት ጊዜ